Welcome to Tech with Kaushik. This is part 11 of our complete practice question series for the DVA-C02 AWS Certified Developer Associate exam. Choose your answer before the timer ends, then review the correct answer, explanation, and exam tip. Let us begin part 11. Question number 406. A versioned S3 bucket must automatically expire current object versions after 365 days and permanently delete non-current versions after they have been non-current for 365 days. Which configuration meets the requirement? Option A. Configure an S3 lifecycle rule with current version expiration and non-current version expiration. Option B. Invoke Lambda only when objects are removed. Option C. Use an object-created notification and keep one Lambda invocation running for a year. Option D. Configure only expired object delete marker removal. The correct answer is A. Configure an S3 lifecycle rule with current version expiration and non-current version expiration. Here is why. Lifecycle expiration creates the delete marker for the current version and permanently removes versions after the configured non-current age. Why are the other options not correct? B. Removal notifications occur after deletion. C. A long-running Lambda timer is unreliable and unnecessary. D. Delete marker cleanup alone does not expire current versions. Exam tip. Versioned S3 retention usually requires both current version expiration and non-current version expiration. Question number 407. An RDS for my SQL instance named PayrollDB was deleted during the past 90 days. The team needs to identify the IAM principal that called the deletion API. Which data source should the developer inspect? Option A. X-ray trace summaries for PayrollDB. Option B. CloudWatch database engine logs. Option C. CloudTrail events whose event name is DeleteDB instance and whose resource identifies PayrollDB. Option D. Systems Manager inventory deletion records. The correct answer is C. CloudTrail events whose event name is DeleteDB instance and whose resource identifies PayrollDB. Here is why. CloudTrail management events record the principal identity, request parameters, source, and time for RDS DeleteDB instance API calls. Why are the other options not correct? A. X-ray traces application requests, not administrative deletion history. B. Database engine logs do not identify the IAM caller of an RDS control plane deletion. D. Systems Manager inventory is not the audit log for RDS API calls. Exam tip. Use CloudTrail to determine who performed an AWS control plane action. Question number 408. A release candidate must remain isolated while QA tests it and developers continue adding features to main. All release bug fixes must later be incorporated into main. Which Git workflow meets the requirement? Option A. Create a release branch from the release commit, apply fixes on that branch, continue feature work on main, and merge the release branch back into main after release. Option B. Create a tag and move the tag whenever a fix is committed to main. Option C. Apply fixes directly to main and use a tag as an editable branch. Option D. Rebase main onto the release branch after unrelated feature work has continued. The correct answer is A. Create a release branch from the release commit, apply fixes on that branch, continue feature work on main, and merge the release branch back into main after release. Here is why. The branch freezes the release line for isolated testing and fixes while main continues forward, and the final merge preserves the fixes in future releases. Why are the other options not correct? B. Moving a release tag and applying fixes to main does not isolate QA. C. Git tags are not normal mutable development branches. D. Rebasing main onto the release branch can rewrite history and does not cleanly integrate parallel feature work. Exam tip. Use a release branch for stabilization and merge its fixes back into the main development line. Question number 409. CloudFormation manages several EC2 security groups. Engineers changed some rules manually for testing, and the developer needs to compare the running resources with the stacks. Expected configuration. Which CloudFormation operation should the developer run? Option A, create a change set. Option B, add a conditions section and update the stack. Option C, run stack drift detection. Option D, use Amazon Detective to compare the template. The correct answer is C, run stack drift detection. Here is why. Drift detection compares supported live resource properties with the values expected from the CloudFormation template and reports out-of-band changes. Why are the other options not correct? A change set previews a proposed template update. B, conditions control resource creation and do not discover manual changes. D, Detective investigates security findings and behavior, not CloudFormation resource drift. Exam tip. Use CloudFormation drift detection to find resources changed outside the stack. Question number 410. A team needs one repeatable infrastructure template that creates identical EC2 environments, installs application software, supports stack updates, and can roll back failed changes. Which approach meets the requirement? Option A, use AppSync schemas and resolvers as deployment templates. Option B, use CloudFormation to define the EC2 infrastructure and invoke CloudFormation helper scripts to install and start the application. Option C, use CodeBuild as the EC2 deployment service with an AppSpec file. Option D, use Amplify traffic splitting for the EC2 infrastructure. The correct answer is B, use CloudFormation to define the EC2 infrastructure and invoke CloudFormation helper scripts to install and start the application. Here is why. CloudFormation provides repeatable desired state environments, updates, and rollback, while helper scripts configure software during instance creation and stack changes. Why are the other options not correct? A, AppSync deploys GraphQL APIs. C, CodeBuild builds artifacts, AppSpec belongs to CodeDeploy rather than CodeBuild. D, Amplify is not the infrastructure template for this EC2 deployment. Exam tip. Use CloudFormation for repeatable infrastructure and helper scripts or user data for EC2 Bootstrap configuration. Question number 411. A code pipeline build stage must compile the application, run automated tests, and publish a structured test report during every build. Which configuration meets the requirement? Option A, configure a code build project and define the report group, test file format, and report paths in buildspec.yml. Option B, put report configuration in a CodeDeploy AppSpec file. Option C, run builds on an unmanaged EC2 instance with SSM agent. Option D, select a test report template from Code Artifact. The correct answer is A, configure a code build project and define the report group, test file format, and report paths in buildspec.yml. Here is why. Code build report groups collect supported test result files produced by the build and display test counts, failures, and trends. Why are the other options not correct? B, code deploy AppSpec files define deployment hooks. C, an unmanaged build host adds operations and does not define code build reports. D, Code Artifact stores software packages, not test report templates. Exam tip. Define code build reports in the build spec reports section and generate the expected test result format. Question number 412. Several Lambda functions need a 6 KB JSON configuration document from AppConfig. The document changes independently of code deployments, and the function should retrieve it with minimal custom integration logic. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A, package the JSON file in every Lambda deployment artifact. Option B, put the document in a Lambda environment variable. Option C, add the AWS AppConfig agent Lambda extension and retrieve the configuration through its local endpoint. Option D, use the X-Ray SDK as the AppConfig client. The correct answer is C. Add the AWS AppConfig agent Lambda extension and retrieve the configuration through its local endpoint. Here is why. The extension retrieves and caches AppConfig data locally for the function, reducing custom API logic and allowing configuration updates without code deployment. Why are the other options not correct? A. Packaged configuration changes require redeployment. B. Lambda environment variables also require a function configuration update and are size constrained. D. The X-ray SDK provides tracing, not app-config retrieval. Exam tip. Use the app-config agent Lambda extension for locally cached dynamic configuration. Question number 413. Multiple VPC-connected Lambda functions need shared access to internal libraries and reference data. Separate teams must update the files independently of function deployment. Which storage solution should the company use? Option A. Mount an EFS file system through access points from the Lambda functions and grant the required execution role and file system permissions. Option B. Attach one EBS multi-attach volume directly to the Lambda functions. Option C. Package the files into each function/tmp directory. Option D. Mount FSX for Windows file server directly as a Lambda file system. The correct answer is A. Mount an EFS file system through access points from the Lambda functions and grant the required execution role and file system permissions. Here is why. EFS provides shared, independently updatable files that multiple VPC-connected Lambda functions can mount concurrently. Why are the other options not correct? B. Lambda cannot directly attach EBS volumes. C/TMP is local ephemeral storage for one execution environment. D. Lambda's native file system integration is with EFS, not FSX for Windows. Exam tip. Use EFS when multiple Lambda functions need shared files that change independently of deployment packages. Question number 414. A Lambda image processing function has stable production code and an updated candidate. The developer must send part of the live invocation traffic to each implementation during testing. Which two steps are required? Choose two. Option A. Publish an immutable version for the original code and another version for the updated code. Option B. Configure code build to shift invocation traffic between unqualified functions. Option C. Create a weighted alias that points primarily to the original version and assigns a traffic weight to the new version. Option D. Create separate function URLs and configure an alias between the URLs. E. Configure an alias to route between other aliases. The correct answer is A. Publish an immutable version for the original code and another version for the updated code. C. Create a weighted alias that points primarily to the original version and assigns a traffic weight to the new version. Here is why. Published versions provide immutable deployment targets, and a weighted alias splits invocations between exactly two versions behind one stable ARN. Why are the other options not correct? B. Code build does not perform Lambda invocation routing. D. Function URLs are endpoints, not weighted version routing targets. E. Lambda aliases route to versions, not other aliases. Exam tip. Publish versions first, then use a weighted alias for controlled Lambda traffic shifting. Question number 415. An ECS service reads runtime limits for concurrent connections and transactions per second. The limits will change over time and must be deployed independently of container releases. Through a validated canary rollout without downtime. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A. Use an in-place code deploy application deployment for every configuration value change. Option B. Use CDK and specify an ECS launch type named ECS Canary 10% 15 minutes. Option C. Run the app-config agent with the ECS workload, grant it access to app-config, and deploy new values with a canary deployment strategy. Option D. Poll a Lambda function for configuration changes and redeploy the ECS service through code deploy. The correct answer is C. Run the app-config agent with the ECS workload, grant it access to app-config, and deploy new values with a canary deployment strategy. Here is why. App-config separates runtime configuration from container deployment and supports validators, monitored canary rollout, and rollback without restarting the ECS service. Why are the other options not correct? A. Code deploy redeploys application revisions rather than dynamically delivering configuration. B. ECS Canary 10% 15 minutes is not an ECS launch type. D. Polling Lambda and code deploy adds unnecessary components and service redeployment. Exam tip. Use AppConfig agent for dynamic ECS configuration and AppConfig deployment strategies for safe rollout. Question number 416. A public single-page application must call a third-party HTTP API. The provider requires a company API key in a request header, but browser users must never receive or view that key. The team wants the lowest cost managed proxy without adding Lambda execution. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A. Create a public API gateway REST API with an HTTP integration and map a static protected API key value into the integration request header. Option B. Create a private REST API that browsers on the internet cannot reach and use an HTTP integration. Option C. Use a public REST API with a Lambda proxy that inserts the key. Option D. Use a private REST API with a Lambda proxy. The correct answer is A. Create a public API gateway REST API with an HTTP integration and map a static protected API key value into the integration request header. Here is why. API gateway acts as the browser accessible proxy and injects the provider key only into the backend integration request, avoiding Lambda cost and client exposure. Why are the other options not correct? B. A private API is not directly reachable by public browser clients. C. Lambda can hide the key but adds invocation code and cost. D. It combines unnecessary Lambda with an inaccessible private endpoint. Exam tip. Use integration request parameter mapping to add server-side static headers that must not be supplied by browser clients. Question number 417. A CDK application with Lambda assets deployed successfully to an alpha account. Its first deployment to a beta account fails with no such bucket because the target environment does not contain the CDK staging resources. Which command should the developer run for the beta account and region before redeploying? Option A. CDK synth. Option B. CDK destroy. Option C. CDK bootstrap. Option D. CDK init. The correct answer is C. CDK bootstrap. Here is why. Bootstrapping provisions the target account and region CDK toolkit resources, including the staging bucket used for Lambda and other file assets. Why are the other options not correct? A. Synth generates the CloudFormation template but does not create the asset bucket. B. Destroy removes deployed stacks. D. Init creates a new local CDK project. Exam tip. Bootstrap every account and region before deploying CDK stacks that use assets. Question number 418. A team wants code pipeline to begin immediately whenever application source changes. Which two supported source approaches meet the requirement? Choose two. Option A. Store the source artifact in S3 and configure the pipeline to react when the source object changes. Option B. Store source on an encrypted EBS volume and monitor file writes. Option C. Use a code commit repository and start the pipeline when a commit changes the configured branch. Option D. Pull an S3 bucket on a fixed 15-minute schedule. E. Store source on EC2 instance, store volumes and invoke the pipeline from the instance. The correct answer is A. Store the source artifact in S3 and configure the pipeline to react when the source object changes. C. Use a code commit repository and start the pipeline when a commit changes the configured branch. Here is why. Both are supported code pipeline source patterns and can use change detection events to start the release immediately. Why are the other options not correct? B. EBS is not a code pipeline source provider. D. Fixed polling is not immediate change triggered deployment. E. EC2 instance store is ephemeral and not a managed pipeline source. Exam tip. Configure event-based change detection for supported code pipeline source providers. Question number 419. An EC2 application in account A must read an existing Kinesis data stream in account B without creating and assuming an additional role in account B. Which two policy changes provide direct cross-account access? Choose two. Option A. Grant the account A instance profile role the required Kinesis read actions for the Stream ARN. Option B. Create an unrelated reader role in account B. Option C. Add trust policies to both roles but do not grant Kinesis read actions. Option D. Attach a resource-based policy to the account B stream that grants the account A instance profile role the required read actions. E. Add a trust policy that describes stream reads instead of role assumption. The correct answer is A. Grant the account A instance profile role the required Kinesis read actions for the stream ARN. D. Attach a resource-based policy to the account B stream that grants the account A instance profile role the required read actions. Here is why. Cross-account direct resource access requires an identity policy on the caller and a resource policy on the Kinesis stream that grants the external role. Why are the other options not correct? B. An additional target account role is unnecessary for the direct resource policy design. C. Trust policies authorize role assumption and do not grant stream read operations. E. A trust policy cannot describe direct Kinesis data access. Exam tip. Cross-account resource policy access normally requires both caller identity permission and resource side permission. Question number 420. An Elastic Beanstalk application writes generated PDFs to a non-versioned S3 bucket. The files are never needed after 90 days, and the developer wants automatic deletion with no daily scanning code. Which solution requires the least development effort? Option A. Run a daily Lambda function that lists and deletes old PDFs. Option B. Add deletion logic and a daily scan to the application. Option C. Create an S3 lifecycle expiration rule that removes objects after 90 days. Option D. Partition objects by date prefix and build a Lambda cleanup process. The correct answer is C. Create an S3 lifecycle expiration rule that removes objects after 90 days. Here is why. In a non-versioned bucket, S3 lifecycle expiration permanently deletes objects after the configured age without application or scheduled cleanup code. Why are the other options not correct? A. A daily Lambda scan adds code, invocations, and list requests. B. Application scanning couples retention to the workload. D. Prefix partitioning and custom deletion logic are unnecessary. Exam tip. Use S3 lifecycle expiration for automatic age-based deletion of non-versioned objects. Question number 421. An S3 object created notification asynchronously invokes a Lambda document processor. The function uses the default asynchronous error handling configuration and times out while processing an event. What happens after the timeout continues on every processing attempt? Option A. Lambda sends the event to a default dead letter queue. Option B. Lambda retries the function twice and then discards the event because no destination or dead letter queue is configured. Option C. S3 continues invoking the function indefinitely until the processing succeeds. Option D. Lambda automatically emails a failure notification through SNS. The correct answer is B. Lambda retries the function twice and then discards the event because no destination or dead letter queue is configured. Here is why. S3 invokes Lambda asynchronously. For function errors such as timeouts, Lambda retries twice by default and discards the event after all attempts when no failure destination is configured. Why are the other options not correct? A. Lambda has no automatically created default DL queue. C. Function error retries are not unlimited. D. Lambda does not create an SNS email notification automatically. Exam tip. Default asynchronous Lambda processing makes one initial attempt plus 2 retries for function errors. Question number 422. Several Lambda functions call an API gateway REST API whose method uses a Cognito user pool authorizer. The callers currently place a user identifier, rather than a Cognito-issued JWT, in the authorization header. Every GET request returns HTTP 403. Which change resolves the authentication failure? Option A. Add an API key to the authorization header. Option B. Add an execute API invoke statement to the API resource policy. Option C. Send a valid Cognito access token or ID token in the configured authorization header. Option D. Send an options request before every server-to-server GET request. The correct answer is C. Send a valid Cognito access token or ID token in the configured authorization header. Here is why. An API Gateway Cognito User Pool Authorizer validates a JWT issued by the configured user pool. A plain user ID cannot pass token validation. Why are the other options not correct? A. API keys are not Cognito authentication tokens. B. A resource policy does not replace failed user pool authentication. D. CORS preflight applies to browsers and does not fix an invalid authorization value. Exam tip. Send the token type expected by the Cognito authorizer, not a username or user ID. Question number 423. A deployment script must package and deploy an existing AWS SAM template and its local artifacts through CloudFormation compatible tooling. Which two command sequences can perform the deployment? Choose two. Option A. Upload the template with AWS S3CP, then call Lambda update function code for the application. Option B. Run AWS CloudFormation package, then run AWS CloudFormation deploy on the packaged template. Option C. Create a local zip file and publish it through serverless repo create application. Option D. Run SAM package, then run SAM deploy. E. Upload one zip file and call CloudFormation create stack without first packaging local artifacts. The correct answer is B. Run AWS CloudFormation package, then run AWS CloudFormation deploy on the packaged template. D. Run SAM package, then run SAM deploy. Here is why. Both workflows upload local artifacts to S3, produce a deployable CloudFormation compatible template, and deploy the SAM application through CloudFormation. Why are the other options not correct? A. Updating one Lambda function does not create all SAM resources. C. The serverless application repository command does not replace normal application deployment. E. CloudFormation cannot deploy unresolved local artifact paths. Exam tip. SAM CLI is the preferred workflow, but CloudFormation package and deploy can also process SAM templates. Question number 424. A Lambda consumer sent several unprocessable SQS messages to the queue's dead letter queue. The application defect is fixed, and the developer now wants SQS to redrive those messages to the source queue. Which API should the developer call? Option A. Start message move task. Option B. Change message visibility. Option C. Purge queue. Option D. Send message batch without reading the dead letter queue. The correct answer is A. Start message move task. Here is why. Start message move task starts SQS dead letter queue redrive and can move messages back to their source queue or another supported destination queue. Why are the other options not correct? B. Visibility changes apply within the queue that contains the message. C. Purge queue permanently deletes messages. D. Send message batch cannot copy messages without first receiving and reconstructing them. Exam tip. Use SQS DLQ redrive or start message move task after correcting the consumer defect. Question number 425. A developer is preparing a SAM application for deployment from a local project that contains function code and a SAM template. Which sequence represents the standard build, package, and deployment flow? Option A. Build on EC2, store the package on EBS, and deploy from EBS. Option B. Build locally, deploy an unpackaged local template, and package it after deployment. Option C. Build locally, package the application into code commit, and deploy from code commit. Option D. Build locally, upload packaged artifacts to S3, and deploy the transformed template through CloudFormation. The correct answer is D. Build locally, upload packaged artifacts to S3, and deploy the transformed template through CloudFormation. Here is why. The SAM workflow builds the application, packages local artifacts into S3 references, and deploys the generated CloudFormation template. Why are the other options not correct? A. SAM deployment does not use EBS as artifact storage. B. Packaging must occur before CloudFormation can access local artifacts. C. Code commit is source control, not the package or deployment destination. Exam tip. Modern SAM deploy can package automatically, but the logical flow remains build, upload artifacts, and deploy through CloudFormation. Question number 426. A Lambda application requires approximately 500 megabytes of code and runtime dependencies. The artifact exceeds the supported unzip zip deployment package limit. Which deployment method meets the requirement? Option A. Upload a zip package directly to Lambda. Option B. Build a Lambda-compatible container image, push it to ECR, and configure the function to use that image. Option C. Put a container image in S3 and configure Lambda to run it from the bucket. Option D. Put a zip archive in S3 and configure Lambda to execute the archive without extracting it. The correct answer is B. Build a Lambda-compatible container image, push it to ECR, and configure the function to use that image. Here is why. Lambda container image deployment supports artifacts much larger than the zip package limit, and Lambda retrieves function images from ECR. Why are the other options not correct? A. The unzipped zip package would exceed the Lambda limit. C. Lambda container images must be stored in ECRD, and S3 zip package is still extracted and subject to the unzipped package limit. Exam tip. Use an ECR-hosted Lambda container image when code and dependencies exceed zip deployment package limits. Question number 427. An API gateway method uses Lambda proxy integration. Invocations reach the function, but API gateway records method completed with status 502. Which correction is most likely required? Option A. Return the Lambda proxy response in the required structure, including a valid status code and correctly formatted body. Option B. Replace the API's HTTP endpoint with an HTTPS endpoint. Option C. Modify the request payload even though the function was invoked. Option D. Change the caller's authorization header. The correct answer is A. Return the Lambda proxy response in the required structure, including a valid status code and correctly formatted body. Here is why. API gateway returns 502 when a Lambda proxy integration produces malformed output or another invalid integration response. Why are the other options not correct? B. The backend protocol does not repair malformed Lambda output. C. The request reached the function, so changing input is not the direct fix. D. Authorization errors normally produce 401 or 403 rather than a malformed response 502. Exam tip. For Lambda proxy integration, return status code and a string body in the expected response schema. Question number 428. A set of microservices runs on EC2. The developer needs to follow one request across service boundaries, identify latency, and inspect downstream dependencies. Which solution provides the required end-to-end visibility? Option A. Use AWS Health to monitor each microservice. Option B. Use CloudTrail as the application request tracing system. Option C. Aggregate only logs and host metrics in a CloudWatch dashboard. Option D. Instrument the services for X-ray compatible tracing and inspect traces and the service map. The correct answer is D. Instrument the services for X-ray compatible tracing and inspect traces and the service map. Here is why. Distributed tracing correlates one request across microservices and displays service dependencies, latency, errors, segments, and subsegments. Why are the other options not correct? A. AWS Health reports AWS service and account events. B. CloudTrail records AWS API activity, not application request flow. C. Logs and aggregate metrics do not automatically create an end-to-end trace. Exam tip. Use OpenTelemetry or X-ray compatible instrumentation for request-level microservice tracing. Question number 429. A Lambda function reads from an SQS standard queue and loads enriched records into Redshift. Testing shows that identical producer messages submitted within 1 minute cause duplicate warehouse rows. The queue must support up to 1,000 messages per second. Which queue design addresses the duplicate submissions? Option A. Reduce the event source mapping's maximum concurrency. Option B. Store processed identifiers in Lambda/TMP. Option C. Use an SQS FIFO queue and enable message deduplication for repeated sends. Option D. Add message group ID and deduplication settings to the existing standard queue. The correct answer is C. Use an SQS FIFO queue and enable message deduplication for repeated sends. Here is why. FIFO deduplication suppresses producer submissions that reuse a deduplication ID, or identical bodies with content-based deduplication, within the deduplication window. Why are the other options not correct? A. Concurrency limits do not identify duplicate producer messages. B/TMP is isolated and ephemeral across Lambda execution environments. D. Standard queues do not support FIFO message groups or deduplication. Exam tip. FIFO deduplication addresses repeated sends. Consumers should still use idempotent writes for possible processing retries. Question number 430. Development and production S3 buckets and Lambda functions currently share one account. A development bucket is mistakenly able to invoke the production function. The company wants a strong environment boundary that prevents a bucket in the other environment from being authorized as an event source. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A. Restrict only the production function's execution role to reading the production bucket. Option B. Place development and production in separate accounts and scope each Lambda resource-based policy to S3 events from the bucket and source account for that environment. Option C. Add Lambda invocation statements to the S3 bucket policies. Option D. Separate the accounts but change only the function execution role S3 read permissions. The correct answer is B. Place development and production in separate accounts and scope each Lambda resource-based policy to S3 events from the bucket and source account for that environment. Here is why. Account separation creates a strong boundary, and source arm plus source account conditions ensure that only the intended bucket can invoke each function. Why are the other options not correct? A. Execution roles control what the function calls, not who can invoke it. C. S3 bucket policies do not grant Lambda invocation permission in this manner. D. Read permissions do not prevent an unauthorized event source from invoking a function. Exam tip. Restrict S3 to Lambda invocation in the function resource policy with both source bucket ARN and source account. Question number 431. A scheduled Lambda function lists all S3 buckets in its account and writes each inventory. Snapshot to DynamoDB. The function currently has only AWS Lambda basic execution role and receives access errors. Which two additional permissions are required? Choose two. Option A. Permission for the execution role to call the required S3 bucket listing API. Option B. Permission for S3 to invoke the scheduled function. Option C. A cross-account role. Option D. Permission for the execution role to write the inventory items to DynamoDB. E. Permission for DynamoDB to invoke the function. The correct answer is A. Permission for the execution role to call the required S3 bucket listing API. D. Permission for the execution role to write the inventory items to DynamoDB. Here is why. The scheduled function itself calls S3 and DynamoDB, so its execution role needs both S3 list all my buckets and the required DynamoDB write actions. Why are the other options not correct? B. Event bridge scheduling, not S3, invokes the function. C. All resources are in the same account. E. DynamoDB is a downstream service and does not invoke the function for this workflow. Exam tip. Lambda basic execution role grants logging only. Add downstream service permissions to the execution role. Question number 432. A learning platform runs on EC2 behind an ALB in one region. Route 53 hosts its public domain. The company wants lower latency for users worldwide without operating duplicate regional application stacks. Which solution has the least operational overhead? Option A. Require all users to connect through client VPN. Option B. Add sticky sessions and use Route 53 geolocation routing to the same ALB. Option C. Put CloudFront in front of the ALB and point a Route 53 alias record to the CloudFront. Distribution. Option D. Deploy the full application to many regions and use latency-based routing. The correct answer is C. Put CloudFront in front of the ALB and point a Route 53 alias record to the CloudFront distribution. Here is why. CloudFront caches eligible content at global edge locations and uses the existing ALB as the origin without requiring multi-region application operations. Why are the other options not correct? A. Client VPN adds access overhead and is not a public acceleration service. B. Sticky sessions and geolocation to one ALB do not create global edge caching. D. Multi-region deployment has substantially more operational overhead. Exam tip. CloudFront can use an ALB as a custom origin to improve global web performance. Question number 433. A code pipeline build deploys a static site from code commit to an S3 origin. The current files appear through the S3 endpoint, but CloudFront continues serving previous cached versions. What should the build spec run after the S3 deployment? Option A. Create a CloudFront invalidation for the changed site paths. Option B. Delete every S3 object before each release. Option C. Change the bucket's CORS configuration. Option D. Synchronize the same files to S3 again without refreshing CloudFront. The correct answer is A. Create a CloudFront invalidation for the changed site paths. Here is why. The invalidation removes stale edge cache entries so CloudFront retrieves the new files from the S3 origin. Why are the other options not correct? B. Deleting source files is unnecessary and can interrupt the website. C. CORS does not control CloudFront cache freshness. D. Reuploading unchanged paths does not evict existing cached responses. Exam tip. Prefer versioned asset names. Use invalidations when existing CloudFront paths must refresh immediately. Question number 434. A gaming application stores scores for players in an Amazon DynamoDB table that has 4 attributes: user_ID, user_name, user_score, and user_rank. The users are allowed to update their names only. A user is authenticated by Web Identity Federation. Which set of conditions should be added in the policy attached to the role for the DynamoDB Poodletum API call? Condition. For all values, string equals DynamoDB leading keys. S. www.amazon.com user_ID. AOL. DynamoDB attributes. User_name. Condition. For all values, string equals DynamoDB leading keys. $www.amazon.com user_name. Option B. ly. DynamoDB attributes. User_ID. Condition. For all values, string equals DynamoDB leading keys. S. $www.amazon.com user_ID. CCI. DynamoDB attributes. Username, user_ID. Condition. For all values, string equals DynamoDB leading keys. $www.amazon.com user_name. D. DynamoDB attributes. User_name, user_ID. I. The correct answer is C. Use the authenticated user ID for DynamoDB leading keys and allow the user_ID and user_name attributes. Here is why. DynamoDB leading keys restricts access to items whose partition key matches the federated user's ID. Because put item must include the table's primary key attribute, DynamoDB attributes must permit both user_ID and the editable user_name attribute. This prevents access to user_score and user_rank. Why are the other options not correct? A. Allows only user_name. A valid put item request must also include the user_ID primary key. B. Incorrectly compares the table's leading key with the federated user's name and permits only user_ID. D. Also uses user_name as the leading key identity value instead of the authenticated user_ID. Exam tip. For DynamoDB fine-grained access, use DynamoDB leading keys to restrict users to their own partition key and include the primary key attributes in DynamoDB attributes. Question number 435. A product catalog requires microsecond reads for frequently requested items. The cache must remain synchronized when the application writes, updates, or deletes products through the same data access endpoint. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A. Use RDS with lazy loading elastic cache and no invalidation process. Option B. Create an application managed in-memory cache in front of DynamoDB. Option C. Use RDS with a DAX cluster. Option D. Use DynamoDB with a DAX cluster and route the application's supported reads and writes through the DAX client. The correct answer is D. Use DynamoDB with a DAX cluster and route the application's supported reads and writes through the DAX client. Here is why. DAX provides microsecond eventually consistent reads. Writes made through DAX are write-through and update the item cache after DynamoDB confirms the operation. Why are the other options not correct? A. Lazy loading can retain stale values without explicit invalidation. B. A custom cache adds synchronization and operational code. C. DAX is a DynamoDB-compatible cache and cannot front RDS. Exam tip. Route both supported reads and writes through DAX when its write-through cache behavior is required. Question number 436. An application revision is stored in S3. Before deploying it to AWS, a developer wants to run and troubleshoot its code deploy lifecycle hooks on a local machine with minimal configuration. Which approach should the developer use? Option A. Create a code build stage and treat its remote build logs as local debugging. Option B. Install the code deploy agent locally and run codedeploy local with bundle location pointing to the S3 revision. Option C. Publish the application package to code artifact and create an upstream repository. Option D. Register the developer workstation as an EC2 deployment target in code deploy. The correct answer is B. Install the code deploy agent locally and run codedeploy local with bundle location pointing to the S3 revision. Here is why. Codedeploy local validates and runs the AppSpec lifecycle hooks from an S3 or local revision on the machine without creating a managed deployment. Why are the other options not correct? A. Code build testing runs remotely rather than debugging the local deployment package. C. Code artifact is a package repository, not a code deploy lifecycle test tool. D. A workstation is not configured as an EC2 instance by selecting it as a deployment target. Exam tip. Use codedeploy local to test EC2 or on-premises AppSpec hooks before deployment. Question number 437. A latency-sensitive API gateway endpoint invokes Lambda. The team needs pre-initialized execution environments to reduce cold start latency under expected production traffic. Which configuration meets the requirement? Option A. Increase only the account concurrency quota. Option B. Configure reserved concurrency equal to current traffic. Option C. Publish a function version or use an alias and configure provisioned concurrency for the expected load. Option D. Increase memory to the maximum and rely on reserved concurrency. The correct answer is C. Publish a function version or use an alias and configure provisioned concurrency for the expected load. Here is why. Provisioned concurrency initializes execution environments ahead of requests and is configured on a published version or alias. Why are the other options not correct? A. A higher quota does not pre-initialize environments. B. Reserved concurrency reserves and limits capacity but does not remove cold starts. D. More memory can improve execution speed but does not guarantee pre-warmed environments. Exam tip. Use provisioned concurrency, not reserved concurrency, for predictable Lambda startup latency. Question number 438. During a major sales event, the operations team must receive an SNS notification whenever An EC2 instance's CPU utilization metric exceeds 80%. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A. Query CloudTrail every 15 minutes with Lambda. Option B. Run a cron job that calls describe instance information. Option C. Create a CloudTrail alarm for CPU utilization. Option D. Create a CloudWatch metric alarm on CPU utilization with an SNS action. The correct answer is D. Create a CloudWatch metric alarm on CPU utilization with an SNS action. Here is why. EC2 publishes CPU utilization to CloudWatch, and a metric alarm can evaluate the 80% threshold and notify the SNS topic automatically. Why are the other options not correct? A. CloudTrail is not the source of EC2 utilization metrics. B. Polling locally adds delay and custom operations. C. CloudTrail alarms evaluate API activity rather than CPU metrics. Exam tip. Use CloudWatch metric alarms with SNS actions for infrastructure threshold notifications. Question number 439. Several Lambda functions retrieve the same advanced parameter store value during every invocation and are being throttled. The parameter changes only when a new CloudFormation deployment occurs and traffic is unpredictable. Which solution avoids runtime parameter store calls most cost-effectively? Option A. Configure reserved concurrency from last month's average. Option B. Resolve the SSM parameter through a CloudFormation dynamic reference and set the resolved value as a Lambda environment variable during deployment. Option C. Retry every throttled getParameter call with exponential backoff. Option D. Purchase or request API throughput that matches peak Lambda traffic. The correct answer is B. Resolve the SSM parameter through a CloudFormation dynamic reference and set the resolved value as a Lambda environment variable during deployment. Here is why. CloudFormation retrieves the parameter during stack deployment, so Lambda invocations read local environment configuration and no longer call parameter store. Why are the other options not correct? A. Reserved concurrency can throttle the application and does not remove each API call. C. Backoff reduces retry pressure but retains runtime calls and latency. D. Higher throughput adds cost and still performs one retrieval per invocation. Exam tip. Resolve deployment-only configuration at deployment time, use runtime retrieval and caching only when values must change independently. Question number 440. A Lambda function logs processing duration measurements. The team needs CloudWatch to extract those values as custom metrics in real time and use them in graphs and alarms. Which implementation meets the requirement? Option A. Emit structured logs in CloudWatch embedded metric format and create CloudWatch graphs and alarms from the resulting metrics. Option B. Use logs insights queries as continuously published custom metrics. Option C. Send numerical metrics to CloudTrail with put metric data. Option D. Stream logs to Kinesis and S3, then alarm directly on S3 objects. The correct answer is A. Emit structured logs in CloudWatch embedded metric format and create CloudWatch graphs and alarms from the resulting metrics. Here is why. EMF extracts metric values and dimensions from structured log events as they are ingested, producing normal CloudWatch custom metrics for alarms and dashboards. Why are the other options not correct? B. Logs insights queries do not continuously publish alarmable metrics by themselves. C. Put metric data belongs to CloudWatch, not CloudTrail. D. S3 log objects are not a real-time CloudWatch metric source. Exam tip. Use EMF when one structured Lambda log event should produce both searchable logs and CloudWatch metrics. Question number 441. A single AWS account uses code pipeline to validate and deploy CloudFormation templates in a primary region and a disaster recovery region. The company wants the most operationally efficient managed multi-region deployment. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A. Use code deploy actions in both regions for CloudFormation templates. Option B. Run custom code build deployment scripts separately in each region. Option C. Use CloudFormation stack sets deployment actions in code pipeline to create and test stack instances in both regions. Option D. Use a SNYK action as the CloudFormation deployment provider. The correct answer is C. Use CloudFormation StackSets deployment actions in code pipeline to create and test Stack instances in both regions. Here is why. StackSets manages one template across multiple regions, and code pipeline provides managed actions for updating the Stack set and its Stack instances. Why are the other options not correct? A. Code deploy deploys application revisions, not CloudFormation stacks. B. Code build scripts can work but create more custom deployment logic. D. SNYK performs security analysis and is not a CloudFormation deployment provider. Exam tip. Use CloudFormation StackSets for centrally managed multi-region or multi-account stack deployment. Question number 442. A serverless game stores user profiles in DynamoDB. Global growth has increased read latency, and the application needs DynamoDB compatible reads with microsecond response times. Which service should the team add? Option A. CloudFront. Option B. DynamoDB autoscaling. Option C. Elastic Cache without changing the application's data access API. Option D. DynamoDB Accelerator, DAX. The correct answer is D. DynamoDB Accelerator, DAX. Here is why. DAX is a managed DynamoDB compatible in-memory cache that provides microsecond response times for eventually consistent reads. Why are the other options not correct? A. CloudFront caches HTTP content rather than DynamoDB API responses. B. Autoscaling adds table capacity but does not provide microsecond caching. C. Elastic Cache requires a separate caching integration and is not DynamoDB API compatible. Exam tip. Use DAX when a DynamoDB workload needs managed microsecond read acceleration. Question number 443. A Lambda-backed API has insufficient CPU for request processing. Before production, the developer needs to increase the CPU available to each function execution environment. Which setting should be changed? Option A. Increase the Lambda memory allocation. Option B. Increase ephemeral storage. Option C. Increase the timeout. Option D. Request a separate virtual CPU core quota for the function. The correct answer is A. Increase the Lambda memory allocation. Here is why. Lambda allocates CPU in proportion to configured memory, so increasing memory also increases available compute for each execution environment. Why are the other options not correct? B. Ephemeral storage changes disk capacity. C. Timeout changes the allowed duration but not CPU allocation. D. Lambda does not expose a per-function virtual CPU core quota setting. Exam tip. Benchmark Lambda memory settings because memory, CPU, and often network performance scale together. Question number 444. A production API invokes a Lambda function through an alias. A defect fix must initially receive only 10% of live invocations while the previous version continues receiving the remaining traffic. Which two steps meet the requirement? Choose 2. Option A. Configure Route 53 weighted routing between Lambda version ARNs. Option B. Publish an immutable Lambda version containing the corrected code. Option C. Configure weighted routing on an API gateway stage without an alias. Option D. Route traffic through a network load balancer. E. Configure a Lambda alias with an additional version weight of 10% for the new version. The correct answer is B. Publish an immutable Lambda version containing the corrected code. E. Configure a Lambda alias with an additional version weight of 10% for the new version. Here is why. The published version is a stable routing target, and the weighted alias sends 10% of alias invocations to it while the primary version receives the remainder. Why are the other options not correct? A. Route 53 does not route directly between Lambda versions. C. API gateway stages do not provide native weighted Lambda version routing. D. NLB does not directly distribute requests between Lambda versions. Exam tip. Publish versions and use weighted aliases for Lambda canary traffic shifting. Question number 445. A SAM template defines one Lambda function and one S3 bucket. The function must receive read-only object access to that bucket through its generated execution role. Which SAM policy template should be attached to the function? Option A. A second Lambda authorizer. Option B. An SQS topic policy. Option C. S3 read policy referencing the bucket. Option D. A bucket policy embedded as a function property. The correct answer is C. S3 read policy referencing the bucket. Here is why. The SAM S3 read policy template expands into the read permissions required by the function's generated execution role for the specified bucket. Why are the other options not correct? A. An authorizer controls API access. B. SQS is unrelated to S3 object authorization. D. A bucket policy is a resource policy and is not the SAM function policy template requested. Exam tip. Use SAM policy templates for common least privileged service access and custom IAM statements for unsupported cases. Question number 446. An EC2 code deployment fails with health_constraints because too many target instances become unhealthy or cannot participate in the deployment. Which two conditions can cause this failure? Choose two. Option A. The code deploy agent is stopped or unavailable on target instances. Option B. The unified CloudWatch agent is not running. Option C. The target instances use an IAM instance profile that lacks the permissions required by the code deploy agent to retrieve the revision and communicate as configured. Option D. The developer's interactive IAM identity lacks permission after the deployment has already started successfully. E. The deployment does not define separate application-level health checks beyond code deploy lifecycle success. The correct answer is A. The code deploy agent is stopped or unavailable on target instances. C. The target instances use an IAM instance profile that lacks the permissions required by the code deploy agent to retrieve the revision and communicate as configured. Here is why. Either condition causes instance deployments to fail. When failures reduce healthy capacity below the deployment configuration's minimum, code deploy reports health_constraints. Why are the other options not correct? B. The CloudWatch agent is not required for code deploy lifecycle execution. D. Caller authorization usually prevents or rejects an API operation rather than making target instances unhealthy. E. Code deploy uses lifecycle outcomes and minimum healthy hosts. A separate custom health check is not universally required. Exam tip. For health_constraints, inspect agent status, instance profile access, instance state, lifecycle logs, and minimum healthy host settings. Question number 447. A serverless application stores sensitive values in Lambda environment variables. The company must encrypt the variables with a key it controls and rotate that encryption key automatically every year without custom code. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A. Use parameter store and configure native yearly parameter rotation. Option B. Use an AWS managed KMS key and write a Lambda rotation function. Option C. Use secrets manager rotation as the encryption key rotation mechanism for Lambda environment variables. Option D. Use a customer managed KMS key for the environment variables and enable automatic key rotation. The correct answer is D. Use a customer-managed KMS key for the environment variables and enable automatic key rotation. Here is why. A customer-managed symmetric KMS key can encrypt Lambda environment variables, and KMS can rotate its key material automatically without custom rotation code. Why are the other options not correct? A. Parameter store has no native annual encryption key rotation setting. B. AWS managed keys are rotated by AWS and do not require a custom Lambda rotation function. C. Secrets Manager rotates secret values, not the KMS key used for Lambda environment configuration. Exam tip. Distinguish KMS key material rotation from Secrets Manager secret value rotation. You have completed part 11 of the DVA-C02 practice series. Continue your preparation by opening the complete playlist and watching the remaining parts in sequence. Please like this video, subscribe to Tech with Kaushik, and enable notifications for more certification exam preparation content. Share your score, questions, or feedback in the comments. Thank you for watching. See you in the next part.